Jonathan Roumie had been invited to a charity event in Los Angeles, and while he was grateful for the opportunity to attend, he had no idea that this night would become one of the most emotional nights of his life. The event was being hosted in a warm, elegant hall filled with lights, soft music, and people from all walks of life. There were actors, musicians, directors, and even community leaders. Everyone had come together to raise funds for a cause that mattered, but to Jonathan, it was just another evening where he could give his support and maybe share a few kind words with the guests. He walked through the hall, shaking hands and greeting those who recognized him. People often stopped him, smiling, their eyes wide as they said how much his role in The Chosen had touched their lives. Jonathan had heard it many times, but he never got tired of it. His work was not just about acting. It had become something deeper, something spiritual. He always felt honored when people connected his performance with their own faith. Still, even on nights like this, Jonathan tried to stay humble, blending into the crowd instead of seeking attention. As the evening went on, the host of the event took the stage, welcoming everyone and thanking them for coming. Jonathan sat quietly at one of the tables, sipping water and listening as the program began. There was laughter, polite applause, and the usual rhythm of speeches. But then the host mentioned something unusual. A special guest had asked to say a few words, a guest who wanted to share something very personal. The air shifted immediately. People whispered at their tables, wondering who it could be. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, curious but not overly expectant. He assumed it might be another actor or perhaps someone from the charity organization. But when the host paused and turned toward the entrance of the hall, a quiet excitement swept through the room. The lights shifted slightly, and the atmosphere grew still. Jonathan felt the hairs on his arms stand up, though he didn't know why. From the side of the room, a figure walked in, not surrounded by cameras or flashing lights, just walking calmly as though he were any other guest. The whispers grew louder, then hushed again as recognition spread. It was Keanu Reeves, the man who had played in so many iconic films, the man who was known in Hollywood as humble, kind, and generous. People rarely saw him at events like this, and the fact that he was here, quietly making his way to the stage, stunned the entire audience. Jonathan blinked in disbelief. He had admired Keanu for years, not just as an actor but as a human being. There was something about him that always seemed different, more real, more grounded than the rest of Hollywood. But why was he here tonight? Why had he chosen this event, out of all places, to make an appearance? Keanu walked with a calm grace, dressed simply, no flashing jewelry, no arrogance. He smiled politely as the audience erupted in soft applause, though many people were too shocked to even clap. Jonathan felt his chest tighten. It was surreal. He never imagined he would see Keanu Reeves in such an intimate setting. The host welcomed Keanu to the stage and the room fell silent. Jonathan leaned forward slightly, his curiosity growing stronger. Keanu wasn't the type to attend these events just for publicity. If he was here, it had to be for something genuine. And when Keanu took the microphone, his voice was calm but carried a weight that immediately caught everyone's attention. Jonathan didn't know what to expect. Maybe Keanu would speak about the charity, or maybe he would just say a few kind words and leave. But as Keanu looked around the room, his eyes searching until they settled on Jonathan, it was clear something different was about to happen. Jonathan's heart skipped a beat. He could feel that this moment was not just for the audience. It was for him. Personally, the suspense in the air was almost too much. Jonathan tried to steady his breathing, unaware of the cameras pointing toward him, unaware of the guests watching his every reaction. At that moment, it felt like the crowded hall had disappeared, leaving only him and the man on the stage. He had no idea that Keanu Reeves had come tonight with words that would touch his soul in a way he would never forget. The whispers had stopped. The clinking of glasses had gone silent. All eyes were on Keanu, and Jonathan felt as if the world was holding its breath. He didn't know yet that the man standing before him carried a message so personal, so heartfelt, that it would leave him in tears before the night was over. For now, all Jonathan could do was watch and wait, his heart heavy with anticipation. Keanu Reeves did not walk in like other celebrities usually did. There was no big announcement, no camera flashes, no security guards making way for him. He entered quietly, almost shyly, as if he was just another guest at the gathering. Yet the moment people realized it was him, the room seemed to freeze. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Glasses paused in mid-air, and every eye slowly turned toward him. Jonathan Roumie sat at his table, stunned. He could hardly believe it. Keanu Reeves, one of the most famous actors in the world, was here, standing only a few steps away. Jonathan had seen Keanu in movies growing up, had admired his calm strength in roles like The Matrix and John Wick. But this wasn't a movie scene. This was real life. And the same man who carried so much presence on screen was now quietly making his way through the hall. Keanu's appearance was simple. He wore a dark jacket, nothing flashy. His long hair framed his face, and he gave small nods of acknowledgement to the people who greeted him. Some whispered his name, others gasped softly, but Keanu didn't react. With arrogance instead, he smiled kindly, as if he was grateful just to be there. That smile immediately warmed the atmosphere. Jonathan couldn't take his eyes off him. He had heard stories about Keanu being humble and down to earth, but to see it with his own eyes was something else. It wasn't just that Keanu was famous, it was the way he carried himself. Calm, gentle, almost as if he wanted to make everyone else feel comfortable instead of drawing attention to himself. The host stepped forward, smiling nervously. Even the host seemed surprised by Keanu's arrival. The microphone squeaked slightly as the host announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome a very special guest." The applause began slowly, almost hesitant, and then grew stronger, but Keanu simply raised a hand, signaling for people not to make too much noise. His humility showed in every small gesture. As he walked to the front of the room, Jonathan's heart raced. Why was Keanu here? What connection could he possibly have with this event? And why did his eyes seem to search the room with such purpose? Then Jonathan noticed it. Keanu's gaze landed on him just for a moment, long enough for Jonathan to feel it deep in his chest. Keanu finally reached the stage and stood at the microphone. The crowd went quiet. The silence was heavy, filled with anticipation. Everyone wanted to know what he was going to say. Keanu cleared his throat softly, his voice calm, steady, but carrying weight. "I didn't come here tonight for attention," he began. "I came here because someone, has touched my heart." His words sent a shiver through the audience. Jonathan felt his breath catch in his throat. Keanu's eyes swept the room again, finally resting on Jonathan. The connection was clear now. This wasn't a random appearance. Keanu had come here with a message. Jonathan shifted in his seat, suddenly nervous. He didn't know what was coming, but he could sense it was personal. The people around Jonathan leaned forward, whispering, some of them already guessing that this moment was about him. Jonathan tried to remain composed, but his hands trembled slightly under the table. He felt as though the spotlight had turned toward him. Even though he was still seated, Keanu continued to speak slowly, his voice calm, but filled with sincerity. His words were not rehearsed, they felt natural, heartfelt. As he spoke, Jonathan realized Keanu was not here to promote a film or to make headlines. He was here because of faith, because of something deeper. Jonathan could see it in his eyes. The hall remained silent except for Keanu's voice, and every sentence he spoke seemed to cut through the noise of the world outside. For Jonathan, the room began to blur. He no longer saw the crowd, the tables, or the cameras. All he could see was Keanu Reeves on the stage, speaking as though his words were meant for him alone. In that quiet, sacred moment, Jonathan understood that this was no ordinary meeting. This was something bigger than himself, bigger than Hollywood, bigger than fame. He didn't know what Keanu was about to reveal, but he knew it would leave an impact that would last forever. His chest tightened, and he swallowed hard, bracing himself for what was to come. The room, filled with some of the most powerful and successful people in Los Angeles, sat in silence, watching a man known worldwide for his action roles stand humbly before them. But for Jonathan, it wasn't the fame that mattered. It was the honesty shining through Keanu's eyes. And as he leaned forward in his seat, he whispered to himself, almost unconsciously, "This is real." He could feel his heart beating faster, his palms slightly sweaty. He wasn't sure if he was ready for the words that were about to follow. But something told him that this was going to change him, not just for tonight, but for the rest of his life. Keanu stood at the microphone, his presence calm but powerful. The entire hall remained silent. Not a single person moved. Everyone wanted to hear what he had to say, but no one expected the first words that came out of his mouth. His voice was gentle, almost fragile, but it carried through the room as if it was meant for every single person. Yet his eyes rested on Jonathan. "I have been watching The Chosen," Keanu said softly. His words caused a ripple across the hall. People exchanged glances, some surprised, some curious. Jonathan froze in his chair. He never imagined that Keanu Reeves, a man known for action movies and dark roles, had been following his work so closely. Keanu paused for a moment as if collecting his emotions before continuing. "I watched it when I couldn't sleep. I watched it when the world felt heavy. And I watched it when I was alone." His voice trembled slightly, but he did not look away from Jonathan, and every time I found peace. Jonathan felt his chest tighten, his hands resting on the table curled into fists as tears threatened to form in his eyes. He had received praise from fans before, from people who told him his work touched their lives, but this was different. This was Keanu Reeves, a man who had faced unimaginable losses in his life, admitting that Jonathan's portrayal of Jesus had given him strength. The audience leaned forward, completely caught in the moment. They could see the raw emotion in Keanu's face. He was not acting, not pretending, he was speaking from his heart. He continued, "Your work reminded me of something I had forgotten, that faith can carry you through even the darkest times." Jonathan could barely breathe. His throat tightened as if the words were lodged inside. He wanted to respond, to say something, but he was frozen in his seat. Every word from Keanu struck him like a wave, flooding his heart with emotions he could not contain. Keanu shifted his gaze briefly toward the audience before returning to Jonathan. "There were nights when grief weighed on me, nights when I thought I could not go on," he admitted. "But then I watched you. I saw your eyes, your voice, the way you carried the weight of love and sacrifice in that role, and it reminded me that maybe hope is still real." The hall was still. Some guests were already wiping their eyes. The weight of Keanu's confession was too much to ignore. Jonathan sat motionless, his lips parted. His mind played through every scene he had performed, every moment on set when he had tried to bring honesty and truth into his role. And now, here was Keanu Reeves, saying that those moments had helped him. Jonathan lowered his gaze for a second, his hands trembling. He wasn't just hearing compliments. He was hearing a man's soul. Keanu was not just thanking him as an actor. He was telling him that in moments of loneliness and pain, the show had given him comfort. Keanu's voice grew softer, almost breaking. "I know what it feels like to lose," he said, and his eyes seemed to darken with memory. "I know what it's like to feel like the world has taken everything from you. But somehow, through your work, I felt like I wasn't alone anymore." Jonathan could no longer stop the tears that formed in his eyes. He raised a hand to his face, trying to compose himself. But his emotions were too strong. The people around him could see the tears streaming, but no one judged. If anything, they felt the depth of what was happening even more. The audience shifted uncomfortably, not from boredom, but from the intensity of the atmosphere. It was rare to see two men, both well-known, both respected, share such a vulnerable exchange in public. Keanu's words were not rehearsed, they carried the weight of truth. Jonathan finally managed to lift his gaze, his eyes locked with Keanu's. In that moment, it was no longer about fame or reputation. It was about two human beings connecting. Through faith and pain, Jonathan wanted to stand to respond, but he couldn't. His voice would have cracked and his knees would have failed him. Keanu let the silence linger for a moment, giving Jonathan space to absorb his words. Then he continued, "You may not realize the impact you've had, Jonathan, but I want you to know that you helped me remember what it means to believe." A hush fell so deep across the hall that the sound of someone sniffing at the far end echoed loudly. People were holding their breath, afraid that moving even slightly would break the sacredness of the moment. Jonathan sat there, unable to hide his tears anymore. He didn't care. He knew this moment was real and that it mattered more than any award or recognition he had ever received. Inside his heart, Jonathan whispered a prayer, thanking God silently for allowing his work to touch someone like Keanu. The irony struck him. He had been playing the role of Jesus for the world. Yet here was Keanu Reeves, reminding him of the true power behind it, reminding him that art could heal, that words could comfort, that faith could still change lives. And as Keanu's eyes remained locked on him, Jonathan knew that this was only the beginning. There was more to be said, more to be shared, and he braced himself for what would follow. But in this moment, he allowed himself to feel the connection, the honesty, and the truth that bound them together in front of everyone. Keanu's voice softened as he stood on the stage. His eyes carried memories that weighed heavy on his heart. He took a small pause as if gathering the strength to continue. Everyone in the hall leaned closer, waiting, sensing that something deeply personal was about to be revealed. Jonathan felt his chest tighten. He knew what was coming would not just be words, but pieces of Keanu's soul. Keanu cleared his throat, his hands resting lightly on the microphone stand. "I've lived through moments of darkness," he began quietly. His tone was so gentle that people in the back of the hall leaned forward, afraid they might miss a single word. "I've known what it feels like to lose people I loved, to have my heart broken in ways I could not understand." Jonathan froze in his seat. He knew Keanu's story. Everyone did. They had read about it in magazines, whispered about it in interviews, but hearing Keanu admit it in his own voice made it real, made it painful all over again. The room fell into a silence so deep it felt holy. Keanu took a slow breath, his eyes lowering for a moment. "I lost someone I thought I would spend my life with," he said. His voice cracked slightly, but he did not stop. "And not long after, I lost my child, too." His words cut through the air like a knife. Jonathan's hand instinctively went to his chest. He could not imagine the kind of pain Keanu carried, the kind of grief that never truly leaves. For a moment, Keanu said nothing more. His silence spoke louder than any words. His shoulders slumped slightly, as if the memory itself was pressing down on him. The audience shifted in their seats, many with tears in their eyes, some covered their mouths. Moved by the honesty of his confession, when he spoke again, his voice was softer but steadier. "In those days, I asked myself why. I asked myself how to keep going. And I'll be honest, I didn't always have the answers." His gaze lifted, and once again it found Jonathan. "But then, I found comfort in something I had almost forgotten. Faith." Jonathan's heart pounded harder. He leaned forward in his chair, his eyes locked onto Keanu's. He could see the rawness in his expression, the sincerity in every line of his face. Keanu was not giving a speech. He was opening his heart. "I am not perfect," Keanu admitted, his lips curving into the faintest of sad smiles. "I don't claim to be holy. But when I watched The Chosen, when I watched your work, Jonathan, I remembered what hope looked like. I remembered that even in suffering, love is still greater. That belief carried me through nights when grief tried to take me." Jonathan could no longer hold back the tears. They slipped freely down his cheeks. His throat tightened until it was hard to breathe. He wasn't just hearing a fan's appreciation. He was hearing a man who had endured unimaginable loss, finding light again. And that light, somehow, had been sparked through his own performance. The audience remained frozen, afraid to move or even breathe too loudly. The truth in Keanu's confession held them in a grip. This wasn't about fame, it wasn't about Hollywood, this was about life, death, faith, and the fragile strength it takes to keep going. Keanu's eyes shimmered, though he blinked quickly, trying to hold back his own tears. His voice lowered almost to a whisper. "When I saw your portrayal, I didn't just see an actor, I saw a reminder. A reminder that love is stronger than pain, and I needed that reminder more than anyone could have known." Jonathan's vision blurred. He lifted a hand to his face, but it was useless. His tears would not stop. He felt vulnerable, but he also felt honored. He realized in that moment that his work had touched someone in a way far beyond what he ever dreamed. Keanu's confession was not only about his grief, it was about healing. It was about the way faith sneaks into broken places and stitches them together quietly, piece by piece. I don't know if I would have made it through some nights, Keanu continued, if I hadn't been reminded that even in silence, even in pain, God is still there. The crowd was silent. Every single person in that room felt the weight of his testimony. Some lowered their heads, reflecting on their own losses, their own pain. It was as if Keanu's words had opened a door for everyone to remember their own journeys through darkness. Jonathan wanted to stand, to walk up to the stage, to put his hand on Keanu's shoulder. But he couldn't move. His body was frozen, overwhelmed by the emotion pouring through him. He whispered a silent prayer, thanking God for this moment, thanking him for showing the world the power of honesty and the strength of faith. Keanu took another deep breath, his chest rising slowly. He looked around the room, then back to Jonathan. I share this not to bring sadness, he said softly, but to remind all of us that love is never wasted. Grief means that love was real, and faith means we can still carry that love with us even after loss. Jonathan lowered his head, tears dripping onto the table. He could hear people sniffing around him, could feel the emotional current that ran through the entire room. Keanu Reeves, the man who had faced some of life's cruelest blows, was standing before them all, choosing to speak of faith instead of despair. And in that moment, Jonathan understood something. He had not just played a role, he had been part of something far bigger. He had been part of someone's healing, someone's journey back to hope. And that realization left him shaking, unable to control the emotions flooding through his heart. The hall was no longer just a place for charity and speeches. It had become sacred ground, a place where grief, faith, and humanity had met. And Jonathan knew that from this moment on, nothing would ever be the same again. Jonathan could not hold it back anymore. His eyes burned, his chest felt tight, and before he knew it, tears were rolling down his face. He tried to blink them away, tried to steady his breathing, but the weight of Keanu's words was too much. He lowered his head, his shoulders shaking as he fought to stay composed, but it was impossible. The moment had pierced too deep into his heart. The audience saw it. People sitting close to him leaned back slightly, giving him space. Some whispered softly, but no one dared interrupt. The atmosphere in the hall had shifted. It no longer felt like a charity event or a glamorous gathering. It felt personal, intimate, almost sacred. Jonathan raised a trembling hand and wiped at his eyes, but the tears kept coming. His lips quivered as he tried to form words, but nothing came out. His throat was tight, and his heart pounded so loudly he could barely hear the silence in the room. He wanted to thank Keanu, wanted to tell him how much his words meant, but the emotions overpowered his voice. Keanu saw it from the stage, and for a moment he paused, letting Jonathan's reaction settle in the room. He didn't rush forward, didn't try to fill the silence with more words. Instead, he gave Jonathan the dignity of his emotion. He let him feel it fully. The two men stared at each other across the hall, one speaking through tears, the other speaking through quiet presence. Jonathan wasn't a man unused to emotion. He had cried during interviews, had been touched by stories from fans. But this was different. This wasn't about admiration. This was about connection. It was about two human beings sharing a moment of truth in front of everyone. His tears weren't just from sadness. They were from gratitude, from awe, from the sudden understanding that his work had done something far greater than he had ever imagined. People in the crowd began to react too. A woman dabbed her eyes with a napkin. A man at the far end of the table bowed his head, holding his hands together as though in silent prayer. Even those who had come for the glamour and excitement of seeing celebrities realized they were witnessing something raw, something real. Jonathan finally lifted his head, his vision blurred from the tears. He locked eyes with Keanu, and in that look he tried to speak the words he couldn't say aloud. Thank you. Thank you for sharing this. Thank you for letting me know that what I gave reached you. His lips trembled into a small, weak smile, a smile filled with humility and respect. Keanu gave him a small nod in return, his own expression soft, gentle, almost protective. It was as if he was silently telling Jonathan, "It's okay. You don't need to speak, I already understand." That unspoken message made Jonathan's tears flow harder. He pressed his hand to his mouth, trying to stop the sob that threatened to escape. The entire hall stayed silent. No one clapped. No one shifted in their seats. They all knew this wasn't a moment to celebrate loudly, it was a moment to honor. And so the silence stretched, filled only by Jonathan's quiet sobs and the heavy emotion in the air. Jonathan thought about his own journey, about how many times he had doubted himself as an actor, how many times he wondered if the sacrifices he made for the role were worth it. And now sitting here, tears streaming down his face, he realized he had been given an answer. His work had reached someone, not just anyone, but a man who carried pain that words could barely describe. The tears wouldn't stop, but Jonathan didn't want them to. For once, he let them flow freely. He didn't care who was watching. He didn't care about cameras or headlines. All he cared about was this moment, this gift of truth. He could feel God's presence in the room, guiding it, holding it, weaving something bigger than either of them could control. Keanu's voice broke the silence again, soft and gentle. "Don't be ashamed of your tears," he said, speaking directly to Jonathan. "They mean that your heart is alive. They mean that your work mattered." Those words struck Jonathan harder than anything before. His tears turned into soft sobs, but now they carried relief, as if a burden had been lifted. The audience reacted again. A few sniffles echoed through the hall. Some nodded. Others simply watched in awe. This was not the Hollywood they knew. This was humanity, stripped bare. Jonathan pressed his hands together, bowing his head slightly in gratitude. His lips finally moved, though his voice was shaky. "Thank you," he whispered, barely audible. But Keanu heard it. Everyone could see it in his trembling lips. That small broken word carried more meaning than a full speech. And so Jonathan sat there, tears still running down his cheeks, unable to stop, but no longer trying to. He had been given a gift tonight, not just the praise of a fellow actor, but the raw truth of a man who had been healed, even if only a little, by his work. That was more than he had ever hoped for. The cameras in the room would later capture his tear-streaked face, but none of them could capture what was happening inside his heart. Only Jonathan knew the weight of it, the way it had cracked him open, the way it had reminded him of the purpose behind his calling. And as Keanu stood watching him, his eyes filled with quiet compassion, Jonathan realized that this was no accident. This meeting, these tears, this moment, had been meant to happen. And though he could not speak it aloud, he knew it was true. God had brought them together for a reason. The room was still heavy with silence. Jonathan sat with tears running down his face, his heart trembling with emotions too strong to hide. Keanu remained on the stage, his eyes soft, his voice calm, and yet there was something unspoken between them. It was as if both men knew the moment wasn't finished. Something more needed to happen. Keanu took a slow step forward, holding the microphone gently in his hand. He paused, then lowered it, placing it back on the stand. His voice when he spoke was quieter, almost private. "Jonathan," he said softly, "may I pray with you?" The words were simple, but they carried a power that made the audience gasp quietly. A prayer in the middle of a Hollywood charity event was not something anyone expected. People glanced at each other, some surprised, others moved, yet not a single person objected. The hall grew even quieter, as though every sound in the world had been muted. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. His tears had slowed, but his heart beat faster. He had prayed with many people before, but this felt different. This was Keanu Reeves, a man admired worldwide, humbly asking to share a prayer with him. Jonathan wiped his face quickly and nodded. His voice too weak to answer, but the gesture enough. Keanu stepped down from the stage, the room watching in awe. His footsteps were slow, respectful, as though he understood the sacred weight of what he was about to do. Jonathan rose from his chair, unsteady but firm enough to stand. The two men met in the middle of the hall, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. Keanu extended his hand. Jonathan took it without hesitation. their hands joined, their heads bowed, and the hall that had once been filled with chatter, music, and clinking glasses now felt like a church. Everyone lowered their heads instinctively. As if drawn into the moment even without being asked, Keanu began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. Lord, thank you for bringing us here tonight. Thank you for the gift of this man, for the work he has done, for the lives he has touched. His words were not polished or rehearsed. They were raw, honest, from the heart of a man who had felt pain and still chosen faith. Jonathan's shoulders shook as more tears fell. He listened, not just with his ears, but with his whole heart. Every word Keanu spoke seemed to wash over him like healing rain. His eyes closed tightly as he whispered his own silent prayer. Thanking God for this unexpected moment, Keanu's voice grew softer. Help us remember that even in our darkest times we are not alone. Help us hold on to love, onto faith, onto the strength you give when we think we have none left. His voice cracked slightly, and for a brief second he paused to collect himself. Jonathan squeezed his hand gently, offering silent support. The audience sat completely still. Some wept openly, others clasped their hands together. A woman near the back whispered Amen under her breath. The air was thick with reverence. It no longer mattered that this was Hollywood, that there were famous people in the room. All that mattered was the prayer being lifted in unity. Jonathan finally found his voice. His lips trembled as he whispered, Father, thank you for using my work to reach hearts. Even hearts I never thought it could reach. Bless Keanu for his courage, for his kindness, for reminding us all tonight what truly matters. His words were short, but filled with sincerity. His voice cracked halfway through, but he kept going. Keanu nodded, his eyes closed. Yes, Lord, he whispered, adding softly, let love guide us, let hope heal us, let faith keep us strong. Together they stood in silence for a moment longer, heads still bowed, hearts connected in prayer. When they finally lifted their heads, their eyes met again. Jonathan's face was wet with tears. Keanu's eyes glistened, but his expression was peaceful. There was no applause. Not yet. The silence lingered, powerful and unbroken. It was as if everyone in the room needed time to breathe, to let what they had witnessed sink in. Slowly, a murmur of emotion spread. Across the hall, people wiped their faces, some whispering prayers of their own. Others sat stunned, unsure of what to say. They had expected an evening of entertainment, but what they had witnessed was something far greater. Jonathan finally whispered, his voice shaking but audible, Thank you, Keanu. Keanu only smiled, softly, and gave a small nod, squeezing Jonathan's hand once more before letting go. The connection between them didn't fade, though. It lingered in the air, something unseen but deeply felt. The host of the event stood frozen at the side of the stage, clearly moved. He didn't rush to break the moment. He knew it was something rare, something that could not be forced. Even the cameras lowered slightly, as though the people holding them felt it wasn't right to interrupt with flashes and clicks. Jonathan took his seat again, still trembling, still wiping his eyes. Keanu returned to the front, but he didn't speak right away. He placed a hand gently on the microphone and waited. He let the silence stretch, giving everyone in the room the space to absorb what had just happened. For Jonathan, the prayer had touched something deep inside. It wasn't just about Keanu's words, it was about the humility, the sincerity, the courage to pray openly in a place where few dared to. He felt honored, but more than that, he felt reassured, reminded that his work, his faith, and his purpose were all part of something larger than himself. And as Keanu finally looked at the audience again, his voice quiet but steady, he said, Thank you for sharing this moment with us. Jonathan lowered his head once more, silently whispering his own gratitude, knowing that this night would stay with him forever. A prayer had turned an ordinary event into a holy experience, one that no one who was present would ever forget. For a long moment after the prayer ended, the hall remained frozen in silence. It was the kind of silence that carried weight, the kind that pressed against the heart. The air felt different, heavier, but also full of something powerful. People had expected speeches, music, maybe even laughter. But what they had witnessed between Jonathan Roumie and Keanu Reeves was something far beyond entertainment. It was raw, it was spiritual, and it left the entire audience stunned. Slowly, the silence began to break. A woman in the front row lifted her hand to her mouth, her eyes red from crying. Another man near the corner wiped at his face, embarrassed. At first, but then realizing he was not the only one. Around the room, people shifted in their seats, many with tear-streaked faces. They hadn't come expecting to be moved like this, but the sincerity of what had happened had touched them deeply. Phones had been raised when Keanu first began speaking, but now no one seemed eager to record. It didn't feel right to treat the moment like just another viral clip. Even the cameras that were rolling for the event seemed to pause slightly, the operators lowering them as though instinct told them this was not about fame. It was about faith. Whispers began spreading across the room, quiet words exchanged between guests. "Did you see Jonathan's tears?" Keanu's voice, he was trembling. This doesn't happen in Hollywood. People struggled to describe what they had just witnessed, because it wasn't something that could be measured or packaged. It was something that had to be felt. Jonathan sat back in his chair, still wiping his face with the edge of a napkin. His hands shook. His chest rose and fell with uneven breaths. He could hear the quiet reactions around him, but he felt as though he was in another world. His heart was still locked in that prayer, in that connection. He whispered a silent, "Thank you," under his breath, letting the words rise in his heart like an offering. Keanu remained near the stage, standing humbly with his head slightly bowed. He didn't smile, didn't look for applause. He simply stood there as if giving the room time to breathe. It was Jonathan who noticed first. Many in the audience were not just touched, they were changed. You could see it in their eyes, a softness, a gentleness that wasn't there before. Then, without anyone asking, a ripple of applause began at one table. It wasn't the usual loud clapping that filled events. It was gentle, slow, almost reverent. Soon others joined in, but even then, the applause never rose to wild cheers. It stayed soft, respectful, like a congregation in a church honoring something holy. Jonathan lifted his head at the sound, his eyes scanning the room. He saw strangers nodding at him with warmth in their eyes, as if to say, "We felt it too." He saw couples holding hands tighter, parents leaning toward their children, even hardened industry figures lowering their heads in thought. Social media would later explode with clips and reactions. People would call it one of the most moving moments they had ever seen in Hollywood. But for those who were there in the room, the memory was sharper, more alive. They had felt the weight of two men opening their hearts to God, and it left a mark. A woman sitting only a few tables away leaned toward her friend and whispered, "I came here to see stars, but I think I just saw faith." Her friend nodded, too choked with emotion to answer. Another man, a producer known for being tough and unemotional, was seen wiping at his eyes, shaking his head as if he couldn't believe it himself. Jonathan placed a hand over his heart, overwhelmed by the faces watching him. He wasn't used to being at the center of attention outside his role. He had always believed his work was about the message, not about himself. But in this moment, the audience wasn't looking at him as just an actor. They were looking at him as a man, a believer, someone who had allowed himself to be vulnerable. Keanu finally looked up, his gaze scanning the hall. He saw the softened faces, the misty eyes, the bowed heads. He gave a small, humble smile, then nodded once more. The audience responded, some clapping again, others whispering, "Amen." It was not the reaction of fans to a celebrity. It was the reaction of souls to something bigger than themselves. One man from the back finally stood, his hands coming together in a firmer clap. His voice rose softly. "Thank you." That broke the dam. More people stood, not shouting, not cheering, but rising to their feet in a standing ovation filled. With gratitude, the sound grew, but it never turned into chaos. It remained gentle, controlled, but deeply emotional. Jonathan stood slowly, still shaky, and gave a small bow of his head. He didn't wave, didn't bask in it. He simply pressed his hand to his chest and whispered again, "Thank you, Lord." His lips trembled as he tried to smile at the people who were still clapping softly. For many in that hall, the night had turned into something they would carry for years. A night where two men reminded everyone that Hollywood was not bigger than faith, not stronger than love, and not brighter than humility. They had come expecting glamour, but they left with something eternal. And as the applause finally settled into quiet again, there was no doubt in anyone's mind that they had witnessed something unique. Not a performance, not a show, but truth. A truth that connected every person in the room to something greater. Jonathan and Keanu stood in silence, their hearts full, their spirits lifted. And the audience, every single one of them, would never forget what they had seen that night. When the evening finally came to a close, Jonathan sat in quiet reflection. His tears had dried, but his heart was still trembling. He had walked into the event expecting nothing more than a night of polite conversation, a chance to support a good cause. Yet what happened with Keanu had shaken him to his core. It was not something planned, not something scripted. It was real, deeply real, and he knew it would stay with him forever. As people slowly began leaving the hall, many stopped by Jonathan's table. Some placed gentle hands on his shoulder, whispering words of encouragement. Others simply nodded at him, their eyes full of emotion. He felt overwhelmed, not by fame or recognition, but by the knowledge that people had been touched by what they had witnessed. For once, it was not about lights or cameras. It was about hearts. Keanu approached him quietly, walking with the same calm presence he had carried all night. He did not come as a star, not as a Hollywood icon, but as a man who had opened his heart. Jonathan rose to meet him, their eyes meeting once more. For a moment neither spoke. They simply shared the silence, their souls still heavy with the weight of what had passed. Finally, Keanu spoke softly. "Thank you for what you've done, not just for me, but for many. You may not realize it, but your work is more than acting. It's a gift, a reminder of hope." Jonathan swallowed hard, nodding slowly, his voice still fragile. "And thank you for reminding me that this gift reaches farther than I ever imagined." Their words were few, but they carried the depth of everything they could not say aloud. When Keanu finally left the hall, people watched him go with quiet respect. There was no shouting, no rushing for pictures, the prayer, the confession, the tears. They had all changed the atmosphere. No one wanted to disturb it with noise. It felt as though everyone knew they had been part of something sacred. Jonathan sat again, his thoughts racing. He replayed Keanu's words in his mind, words about grief, about loss, about finding peace in unexpected places. He realized something important. He had been so focused on playing his role well, on delivering truth on screen, that he hadn't always understood just how deeply it could touch someone's life. Tonight had shown him that his calling was bigger than he thought. It wasn't just about performing. It was about healing, about reaching into broken places. The following days proved the power of the moment. Clips of the event began spreading across social media. Short videos of Jonathan crying as Keanu spoke, or of the two men bowing their heads in prayer, appeared everywhere. Millions watched in awe. Some said it restored their faith in humanity. Others admitted it brought them to tears even though they weren't there. The story was shared not as gossip, but as testimony. News outlets picked it up, not in their usual tabloid tone, but with a surprising reverence. Headlines spoke of Keanu's heartfelt confession and Jonathan Roumie's tears of faith. The world, so used to scandals and noise, suddenly had something pure to talk about, and people clung to it, desperate for hope in a world that often felt too dark. For Jonathan, the impact went far beyond headlines. He began receiving letters and messages from strangers across the globe. People shared their own stories of grief and loss, telling him how much Keanu's words and Jonathan's tears had meant to them. They wrote about watching The Chosen late at night when they felt broken, about finding peace in moments they thought would never end. Jonathan read every message with tears in his eyes, realizing that the moment was still rippling outward. He also thought often about Keanu, not just as a famous actor, but as a man of humility and courage. It would have been easy for Keanu to stay silent, to keep his grief private. Yet he chose to share it, and in doing so, he gave others permission to open their own hearts. Jonathan respected him more deeply than ever, not because of his fame but because of his honesty. In the weeks that followed, Jonathan carried himself differently. He walked with more awareness, more gratitude. Whenever he stepped onto a set or spoke to fans, he remembered that every word, every gesture, could touch someone in ways he might never see. He was reminded that acting was not just about telling stories, it was about being part of something bigger, something eternal. For Keanu, the night also left a mark. Friends later said he spoke often of that evening, of how much lighter he felt afterward, as though speaking his grief aloud and sharing his prayer with Jonathan had lifted a burden he had carried for years. The moment had not only healed others, it had healed him too. The two men stayed in touch not as celebrities bound by industry ties, but as brothers in faith. Their connection remained quiet, away from headlines, but real. They would exchange messages now and then, offering encouragement, reminding each other of the truth they had shared. And for the world, the story lived on. It wasn't just another Hollywood moment that faded with time. It became a reminder that even in the most unexpected places, faith could rise, hope could bloom, and hearts could be touched. People still spoke of it months later, recalling the night when Jonathan Roumie broke down in tears and Keanu Reeves offered an emotional message about Jesus. Jonathan often returned to that memory when he felt tired, when the weight of his work felt too heavy. He would close his eyes and see Keanu's face, hear his trembling voice, feel his hand during the prayer, and he would remember. This was why he did what he did. Not for fame, not for recognition, but for moments like this, moments that could change lives. That night was not just an event, it was a testimony, a living story of pain, faith, and healing. It proved that even in Hollywood, even under bright lights, there was room for truth. There was room for God, and Jonathan knew with every beat of his heart that he would never forget it.